But first, after a brief stoppage in fighting overnight, violence continues between Israel and Hamas. And now Lebanon this morning. Smoke clouds and flames could be seen rising from Gaza buildings at sunrise following overnight attacks from Israeli warplanes. This while sirens blared through an Israeli city near the Gaza border. Warning of a Hamas rocket attack. The Israeli military says close to 90 rockets were launched from Gaza overnight, bringing the total to more than 3,300 since the conflict began last week. Israeli forces also reported a shelling of Lebanon last night in retaliation for 6 rockets fired toward Israel. Tensions have been high at the Israeli-Lebanese border, where protesters have come out in support of the Palestinians. After a meeting with top defense officials, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said yesterday that Israel would, quote, continue to strike terror targets for as long as necessary. Gaza's health ministry says 212 people have been killed since airstrikes began last week, including 61 children. Israeli officials have reported 10 deaths, with 2 being children. Willie.
Meanwhile, in a call with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, the White House says President Biden, quote, expressed support for a ceasefire. According to a White House readout of that call, the president, quote, reiterated his firm support for Israel's right to defend itself, while also, quote, encouraging Israel to make every effort to ensure the protection of innocent civilians. The carefully worded statement comes as a number of Democrats urge the president to speak out more forcefully against Israel. Joining us now, longtime foreign correspondent Martin Fletcher, who's reporting for NBC News in Tel Aviv. Martin, good morning. What's the very latest from where you're sitting?
Hi, Willie. Good morning, everybody. It was a fairly quiet night in most of the area, and then it suddenly took off in the morning with Israeli jet warplane attacks on Gaza, rockets from Gaza into Israel. You mentioned the new twist, if you like, which is the fact that rockets were fired from Lebanon towards Israel. It's actually the second time that's happened. 6 rockets fired from Lebanon towards Israel. Apparently, they all landed short, and Israel retaliated with artillery fire against the source of those rocket attacks. But the fear, of course, is that as long as there's no ceasefire, the greater the possibility of the conflict spreading. Lebanon being an obvious possibility of extra warfare here. So there's pressure building for a ceasefire, pressure also from the United States on Israel. But my political sources here told me, yes, there is pressure from America, but it's not what they call, quote, strong pressure. So Israel seems to have the green light from the United States to continue knocking off those targets that it has in Gaza, the tunnels, the homes and offices of Islamic military leaders in Gaza. And at the moment, there's no sign that there's any real movement towards a ceasefire from either side, Willie.
So, Martin, Joe Scarborough here. In calls over the past several days, it seems diplomats in the region, also foreign policy leaders in this country, keep quietly saying the same thing. We're focusing right now on Hamas. We're focusing right now on the missiles. But what the Israelis should be most concerned about is the civil unrest. Arabs make up 20%, obviously, of Israel. And the Arab Israelis and the Israelis for the first time inside the country really experiencing flashpoints. Can you talk about that and talk about the long-term danger that poses for the nation of Israel?
Absolutely, Joe. Look, as you indicate, look, this is the 5th round of fighting between Hamas and Israel in the last 15 years. So there's a certain cycle. Presumably, there'll be, unfortunately, going to be more dead on both sides. Then there'll be a ceasefire negotiated of some kind. And then the conflict will go on hiatus, if you like, till the next round. What is new is the fighting inside Israel between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews. And that is a very significant deterioration in relations inside a country that is extremely fragile based on on an easy relationship between Jews and Arabs. That is now falling apart. Today, for instance, there's been a call for a general strike among Arabs on the West Bank and Arabs inside Israel. Arabs are gathering on street corners all over the area. There's been another terror attack foiled on the West Bank. There's 8 terror attacks foiled on the West Bank in the last 3 days. So it's building up, and that the possibility of putting that genie back in the bottle, if you like, of Arab unrest against Israel, and not only Arab unrest against Israel, I have to point out, it's also Israeli unrest against the Arabs. These are basically mobs on both sides who are not fighting each other and mob against mob. It's both sides, Jews and Arabs, looking for easy targets, beating them up, in some places killing them. One Israeli Jew who was severely beaten a few days ago, he died. So that's one Israeli literally beaten to death by a Palestinian mob. And Palestinians have also been killed by Israelis. So this is an extremely tense, dangerous, volatile situation that is going to need some serious thought about how to get Jews and Arabs back on the same page inside Israel. And this is being played out, of course, in the attempt to form a new government. Prime Minister Netanyahu has gathered support from the right wing over the last several attempts to form governments, his fourth in 2 years, by whipping up discontent with the Arabs. And the Arabs feel disassociated from the country. This is not something that comes just from the violence in Gaza now. It's something that's been building up for many years, whipped up by right-wing politicians in Israel, and Arabs feeling disenchanted, separated from the state, losing their role. They're not so sure of their position inside the country anymore. They're young, they're angry, they're hopeless because many don't have jobs. This is a very volatile situation, Jews and Arabs inside Israel, that does not augur well for the future, Joe.
All right. Thank you so much, NBC News' Martin Fletcher. We greatly appreciate it. Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.